Capcom is very well known for their crossover titles, spanning their wide variety of characters from across their history. Marvel vs. Capcom, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, Capcom vs. SNK, there's a ton to love. But there's one crossover game in an established crossover series I hear almost nobody talk about anymore, and there's a reason for that. You could only play it for around 8 months, and then never again. It was controversial at the time of its release, but long past it, I miss it, and I think it deserved better. I'd like to shine a light on a game with very little information left on it. Let's talk about the short-lived Puzzle Fighter reboot. Puzzle Fighter started its life as an arcade game in 1996 called Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, and was Capcom's response to the rise of puzzle games at the time. It was primarily based on the Street Fighter 2 cast, with some characters from Alpha and Darkstalkers making the cut as well. The game has a strong cult following thanks to its easy to pick up and play mechanics, while also being really unique for puzzle games at the time. In Puzzle Fighter, blocks do not clear themselves like in other puzzle games. Instead, you need a matching color breaker piece to continue. In order to score points and send big damage to your opponent, you need to create a square or rectangle of colored blocks at minimum 2x2 and pop it with your breaker. The bigger the better. There's also a rare power gem piece that can break all gems of a single color, but doesn't reward as much damage. Sending garbage to the opponent will create blocks on their side of the field that are locked for a few turns. At first, these cannot be matched, but can be destroyed by adjacent breakers. However, after 5 turns, you can access them and use them as normal. The garbage drops aren't random and are actually determined by the character you're playing. For example, Ken always fills each row with one color at a time, and Dan can only send red blocks. The goal of the game is to top out their board, letting you win the game. It's a simple but addictive formula that has made Capcom a lot of money with many different re-releases over the years all the way up until 2022. With a franchise so popular, it's a shock that the game has never gotten any sequel, as there's really nothing else like it. And that's exactly what Capcom Vancouver thought. A small team at the studio began work on their own take on the franchise, and on August 31st, 2017, the world got its first look at the new Puzzle Fighter, and at the time, its reveal was very mixed. This wasn't a big budget sequel, but rather a mobile game in the same vein as something like Clash Royale. You would have to unlock and upgrade characters through chests, unlocked by playing or paying money. Furthermore, the art style was quite controversial too. While it kept the chibi style of the predecessor, they didn't translate the way people were expecting. Personally, I do like the art style, but I think the proportions look less exaggerated compared to the predecessor. It also didn't have the largest budget, so a lot of the animations leave a lot to be desired. But on the other hand, the game did look to be a revival of the beloved franchise, with a new roster filled with characters from all across Capcom history. It also seemed to introduce a lot of new and interesting mechanics to the series, but we wouldn't really get a clear picture on those until the game fully released. And we didn't have to wait long, when the game launched in November of that year. And while the gameplay had quite a few flaws, it also made a lot of core additions to the game that were quite interesting. First off, a new win condition was added. Instead of just matching pieces to build a big enough square to fill your opponent's side of the board with blocks, you could now deal damage with attacks instead. Killing your opponent was now the name of the game. In fact, one of the most controversial changes to the mechanics was that you couldn't die from filling your board, instead having your lower rows emptied and taking a huge chunk of damage. In the grand scheme of things, while this change was significant, getting a bad board state from garbage would still spell your doom if you played poorly either way. With the addition of the health mechanic, the game could be expanded to make characters much more unique. Instead of just having different garbage drop patterns, each character now had their own set of special moves. Each special move has its own activation requirements, such as building a shape of a certain minimum size, and by doing so, would perform a variety of effects. Characters started with a few skills, but more could be unlocked to allow for some customization. Generally, the more powerful the skill, the more difficult the condition to use it. Weak skills would do things such as deal better damage or provide a slight heal, whereas more powerful attacks could do things like disable the opponent's gems from being broken for a turn, or steal a hefty chunk of super meter. Speaking of, every character also had an additional skill that does a lot of damage, but isn't activated by making a certain match. Instead, by making any match, you could be rewarded with super meter that could then be spent on this attack. A really fun consequence of this mechanic is that instead of a power gem hitting the bottom just doing nothing, it would give you a bunch of super instead, making it worthwhile to do when you've got an early power gem. That's already a lot, but in addition to all that, the game is also a team game. While you do have one main character that you play, you can also bring in support characters. Every character in the game has a unique assist that they can use, which works like a normal special move. Every character on your team also has an affinity for a certain gem color. which has character-specific bonus effects when you match gems of that color. This is usually just more damage, but some characters can get other effects such as more meter gain. These effects get stronger with more characters of the same affinity, so it's usually good to bring 3 of the same color. These mechanics led to some really interesting variety with the cast. Some characters could snowball out of control and do absurd damage if left alone, whereas others preferred to lock down the opponent's board and prevent them from getting their offense going. Of course, there was one big issue with this system, and that's that it was bogged down by having to unlock and level up characters through chests. But when you could look past that and when the gameplay worked, it was quite a lot of fun. The amount of references and attention to detail was huge too. The game was truly a love letter to all their franchises. Mainstay franchises like Street Fighter, Mega Man, and Devil May Cry were referenced, but there were a lot of obscure ones too. Cyberbots, Dino Crisis, Beautiful Joe, and even Power Stone all got some love here. It was truly a love letter to everything Capcom had done, even if it was a bit bogged down by the microtransactions. And then, just as it was starting to find its footing, it left without a trace. In April of 2018, an internal decision was made to shutter the development of Puzzle Fighter. A few months later, the game was taken off the App Store and the servers finally closed at the end of July of that year. Even for a mobile game, this was a shockingly low amount of time. So, what happened? There are quite a few factors, and I do think the situation is very much worth talking about. The least likely theory that I have heard spreading around was that a lot of people left due to the balance of the game. Near the end of its lifespan, the game introduced Beautiful Joe and Elaster to the game. These two were very unique in that they had a unique condition for their attacks no other character had. Instead of their attacks being based on getting a square of a certain size, their specials activated upon chaining together combos of breaks. This changed the game in a lot of ways, and from what I can tell was a very strong option. For example, while stun effects could still be powerful, the lockdown they provided wasn't really as impactful on Joe and Elaster, as it wouldn't really stop them from chaining a combo of small breakers to get their abilities off. It's hard to truly tell the impact of these characters as there's very little knowledge about the meta of the game remaining, but I do remember hearing a lot about these two. However, I don't think that they were the reason the game died. Honestly, the game really likely didn't have the players to sustain it in the first place. Looking at their YouTube and social media, the interactions with the game were shockingly low for what it was. Their YouTube channel has less than 1,000 subscribers, and a lot of their videos didn't have much traction either. The game had 500,000 downloads at the time of its shutdown, which may seem like a lot, but for a company like Capcom, may not have been enough to sustain them. Furthermore, the lack of any footage on the game, or at least very little, seems to suggest that people just weren't playing a lot of it at the time. And, well, that's that, right? This is just a mobile game that didn't find an audience, as simple as that. Well, no. It wasn't supposed to end like this. According to Liam Robertson in an old Did You Know Gaming video, Capcom Vancouver didn't want to let Puzzle Fighter die. In fact, they had a lot of plans to expand the game by giving it life as a console game rather than a mobile one. This would have involved new characters, new stages, and even a possible story mode. The game was Capcom Vancouver's pet project, and they didn't want to see it go. Unfortunately, as some of you may know, time was not kind to Capcom Vancouver. Shortly after Puzzle Fighter closed down, Capcom Vancouver closed its doors for good. They dedicated their entire existence to the Dead Rising franchise and were unable to get that off the ground, leading to the closure of the studio. While this is something that many saw coming with the failure of Dead Rising 4 and a stagnation from the company past that point, it left many talented developers jobless and their projects abandoned. I understand that this project is likely long gone, but deep down, part of me still thinks that there's hope for another part of Capcom to bring it back. On September of last year, Capcom shut down another one of their mobile projects, Mega Man X Dive. The game lasted significantly longer, for 3 years, but it couldn't last forever, and the game eventually had to stop receiving updates and close its doors. However, this time, Capcom made an effort to archive the game. A version of the game without the online features and without any microtransactions was released on Steam and mobile devices as Mega Man X Dive Offline. This was a huge win for game preservation, and it also begs the question, could this be a precedent for the future? Capcom has many mobile games that had a cult following only to be lost, like Crossbeats and Outer Ranger, and many that may one day suffer the same fate, like DMC King of Combat and Tekken. Capcom seems aware of the demand to preserve these old titles, and I want to play this game again one day. I know this was a very brief overview of the game, but I really had a blast with it. I loved goofing around with Phoenix Wright, stacking high enough to get some evidence and absolutely destroying with his power-up. If anyone else has memories of this game, I'd love to hear them. I hope the discussion around this game can kick up once again, and if there's any chance Capcom has the files for it lying around somewhere, they're able to do something with it. Make this short-lived passion project able to live again.